The carriage had no windows she could open. She had tried, in the first hour, running her fingers along every seam of the leather panels, pressing at the brass fittings with the heel of her palm. Not out of hope. Out of habit. Ylva Nilsson had learned long ago to map every room she was put in. Find the exits. No, before the door closed, where the light came in and where the dark pooled deep enough to swallow a person whole. There were no exits here. Only the rattle of iron-rimmed wheels against mountain stone and the wind coming down from peaks she could not see, sharp and indifferent as everything that had ever blown through her life. She folded her hands in her lap and stared at them. Plain hands. Unadorned. The court women had always called them servants' hands. On the rare occasions they said anything about her at all. She thought about Lady Ira collapsing in the throne room. The artistry of it. A woman who understood that some bodies were worth protecting and knew exactly how to remind a king of that fact. She thought about Alaric's gaze moving through the hall like a torch searching for kindling, past silk, past jewels, past every woman who mattered, until she found the gray cloak in the back. The girl with no house name. The girl no one would miss. She had not flinched. Flinching invited cruelty, and she had learned that lesson young enough that it lived in her bones now, quieter than breath. Ahead, through the gap in the carriage curtain, the mountains opened and something dark rose against the pale winter sky. She was here. Quick pause, comment where you're watching from, and if you're enjoying this story, please like and subscribe. I've got a lot more coming. Chapter 1. The Hall of Blackstone. The Great Hall of Keldrath was not what she had imagined. She had prepared for brutishness. A warlord's room, animal hides, the smell of old blood and smoke, men who laughed too loud to drown out the sound of what they were. She had arranged her face for that the way she arranged it for most things, carefully, ahead of time, so that nothing she felt would be visible when it mattered. What she walked into was something else entirely. The hall was vast and dark and lit by fire, not torches along the walls, but enormous braziers spaced down the length of the room, throwing columns of amber light upward toward a ceiling lost in shadow. The walls were carved black stone, the carvings worn to near abstraction by age, wolves and mountains, and something that might have been a sun or might have been an eye, indistinguishable in the firelight. There were no trophies. No banners proclaiming victories she was meant to be frightened of. Only the stone and the fire and the dark, and beneath all of it, the cold. It hit her before she crossed the threshold. Not winter cold, she knew winter cold, had walked through enough of it on the 4-day mountain road to understand its particular grammar. This was different. Personal, somehow. Pressing at the edges of her awareness the way a held breath presses against the chest, not painful, not violent, but insistent. A temperature that came from no direction she could name. She kept her breathing even. She did not slow her stride. At the far end of the hall, on a throne that looked less like furniture and more like a declaration, Linus Larsson sat very still. She had 4 seconds to observe him before protocol demanded she lower her eyes. She used them the way she used all limited resources, completely. Dark hair, loosely pulled back, falling to the jaw. Armor of black leather etched with silver and patterns that echoed the carvings on the walls around him, as though the room had been designed to contain him specifically, or he had been designed to fill it. A fur cloak across broad shoulders, so black it seemed to absorb the torchlight rather than reflect it. His hands rested on the arms of the throne without tension. His face was still. Not blank, still. The distinction mattered. Blank was empty. This was control. His eyes were already on her. Lord Castle began his speech behind her. Ylva stood at the appropriate distance, hands clasped, face arranged in the neutrality she had spent years perfecting. She listened to Castle's words without hearing them. She was managing the cold, which was intensifying slightly with each step closer to the dais, and she was managing the more difficult problem of a man who had not looked away from her face since she entered the room. He was not looking at her the way Veldrunian men looked at her. Not assessing her usefulness. Not registering the absence of it. He was looking at her the way she looked at unfamiliar rooms, with methodical attention, learning the architecture of her. It was profoundly unsettling, and she was not a woman who unsettled easily. The speech ended. The treaty document was brought forward. Seals were produced and verified and pressed with the particular ceremony that powerful men used to make their agreements feel inevitable. Castle concluded with a formal flourish, gestured toward Ylva with the air of a man presenting a receipt, and turned back toward the dais. Linus Larsson had not acknowledged a single word of it. He had not shifted his gaze. Castle cleared his throat, made the gesture again. The delegation of Veldrun presents. She stays. His voice was lower than she had expected. Not loud, he had no need for loudness. The room arranged itself around whatever he said, the way still water arranged itself around a stone. 2 words, and every person in the hall went very still. Castle blinked. My lord, the arrangement was a symbolic. The treaty is signed. Linus had not looked at Castle once. He had not looked at anything except Ylva's face. She is mine now. The silence that followed had texture. Ylva felt it against her skin, dense and charged, full of things unsaid, the specific discomfort of men who understood they were not going to win but hadn't admitted it yet. Castle tried twice more. His objections died in the air between them, not from any particular response Linus gave, but simply because Linus declined to acknowledge them, and a man who will not be argued with cannot, in practice, be argued with. Ylva stood in the center of all of it and did not move. Did not look at Castle. Did not look at the doors. She was doing the only productive thing available to her, which was watching Linus Larsson watch her and trying to understand what he was seeing. He was waiting for something. She understood that much. His eyes were on her face with the careful patience of a man who had asked a question, not aloud, not in any language she could translate, and was waiting to see what the answer would be. She gave him nothing. Not because she had nothing to give, she was, in this moment, a storm of things she would need hours alone to process, but because nothing was the only currency that could not be taken from her. Something shifted at the corner of his expression. Fractional. The barest acknowledgement of something he had not expected. He spoke to an attendant at his right without breaking eye contact with her. The East Chambers. She is a guest. See that she's treated as one. Within minutes, she was being guided through corridors of black stone, through firelight and shadow, away from the hall and the king and the cold that had pressed itself against her like a second presence. The attendant did not speak. The corridors were quiet in a way that felt deliberate, as though the castle itself kept its own counsel. The East Chambers were larger than anything she had been given in Veldrun. A sitting room with a fireplace already lit, a sleeping room hung with dark fabric, windows that looked out over mountains so close and enormous they seemed less like landscape and more like weather. A table with food she couldn't eat. Chairs softer than any she had sat in. She stood in the center of it and did not sit. Outside, the last light was leaving the mountains, the peaks turning from gray to that deep violet that came before true dark, the sky above them the color of something on the edge of saying something. She watched it happen with her hands loose at her sides. He had not explained. He had not been cruel. He had not performed the dominance she had spent 4 days on a mountain road preparing for. He had simply looked at her with a directness she still didn't have a word for, and said she would stay, and the room had agreed with him, and that had been that. She did not understand what kind of man made a decision like that. She did not understand what he had seen. She turned from the window and sat down by the fire because standing had become a performance with no audience, and performances cost energy she could not afford to waste. The cold was still present, fainter here, removed from the hall and the man in it, but there. A low hum beneath the warmth of the flames. A second temperature layered under the first. She held her hands toward the fire and watched the light move across them. Plain hands. Unadorned. She thought about the way he had looked at her, not like she was nothing, not like she was useful, not like she was a problem to be solved or a symbol to be used and returned. Like she was a language he had been trying to read for a very long time and had only just found the first page of. She thought, I do not know what to do with that. She thought, I am going to have to figure it out. Outside, the mountains went fully dark. The fire crackled. The cold hummed its quiet, insistent note beneath the warmth. And Ylva Nilsson, who had spent her entire life learning to want nothing, sat in a room she hadn't asked for and tried to remember the last time anyone had looked at her like she was worth the trouble of understanding. She couldn't. That felt, for reasons she refused to examine, like the most frightening thing that had happened to her today. Chapter 2. The rival comes to her. He came without announcement. She was sitting at the window, not because the view comforted her, but because it gave her something to look at that wasn't the inside of a room she hadn't chosen, when the door opened and Linus Larsson walked in as though he owned every space he had ever entered, which, she supposed, he did. He was without the armor now. Dark clothing, plain cut. A leather belt. No cloak. He looked, stripped of the ceremonial weight of the throne room, like a man who had been many things before he became a king and hadn't entirely discarded all of them. The cold came with him. She felt it arrive before he crossed the threshold, that particular atmospheric pressure she was beginning to associate with his presence specifically. He dismissed her attendant with a look. The woman left without hesitation. Ylva did not stand. She had thought about this. What posture said, who deference served, what she owed a man who had made a unilateral decision about the course of her life in a room full of witnesses. She stayed in her chair and watched him come further into the room and decide, apparently, that the chair nearest the fire suited him. He sat in it with the careful movements of a man who was concealing something physical, a deliberateness that was fractionally too controlled to be simply how he moved. She filed that away. "I won't hurt you," he said. Not as preamble to something else. As a statement of fact he felt she should have. "You'll forgive me," she said, "if I reserve judgment on that." He looked at her, that same quality of attention she had felt in the hall, direct and unhurried, as though he had nowhere more important to be and found the destination worth the patience. "Fair," he said. She waited. He did not fill the silence the way men usually did. In her experience, men in positions of power over her tended to perform their authority. They talked, they explained, they gave her the shape of the walls so she'd understand she was inside them. Linus sat in the chair by her fire and looked into the flames and let the quiet stretch between them without any apparent discomfort. She found this more unnerving than talking. "Why am I here?" she asked, finally. "Because I asked for a woman to be sent. Alaric sent you a symbol. Something to make the treaty feel real. He expected me back within the week. I know what Alaric intended." He looked at her again. "It isn't what I intend." "And what do you intend?" He was quiet for a moment. Not evasion. She was good enough at reading people to know the difference between a man who was avoiding a question and a man who was choosing his answer carefully. "I intend to find out whether what I believe about you is accurate," he said. "That takes time." "What do you believe about me?" "That you are more observant than you let on. That you are used to being dismissed and have learned to use it. You gathered more information in that hall tonight than Lord Castle collected in a month of diplomatic correspondence. That you are not afraid of me, that you believe you should be." A pause. "That you were not sent here by accident." The last sentence landed differently than the others. She kept her face still. "The delegation was chosen by King Alaric." "Yes." He said it simply, without inflection, and left the space around it empty in a way that made the word mean more than it should. She looked at the fire. She thought about Alaric's eyes finding her in the back of the throne room, the precision of it, the specific quality of his attention in that moment, which she had told herself was indifference and was now reconsidering. "You think he chose me specifically," she said. "I think a man like Alaric does not send anything without purpose." He turned to look at her fully. "You are the purpose." "I don't know yet what kind." She absorbed this. It was a strange sensation, being told by a man who had appended her life that she was more than anyone had claimed, and not knowing whether to feel vindicated or afraid. "You're telling me this," she said. "Why?" "Because you'll figure it out regardless, and I'd rather have you as an ally than a secret keeper." She looked at him. Really looked. The way she hadn't permitted herself in the hall took in the quality of his attention, the way the firelight moved across the angles of his face, the cold that pressed at the air around him without his seeming to notice it. He was, she admitted to herself with the specific reluctance of a woman who had learned that beauty in powerful men was usually a warning, extraordinary looking. And also, which she hadn't expected, honest. She could read dishonesty in a face the way other people read weather. Whatever Linus Larson was, he was not lying to her. That frightened her more than if he had been. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" Something easier to dismiss. Something moved at the corner of his eyes, that same fractional expression she had seen in the hall, the one that wasn't quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. "And now?" "Now," she said, "I think I need to know more before I decide anything." He nodded once, as though this were exactly the answer he had hoped for. He stood, those careful movements again, the deliberate management of something, and moved toward the door. She watched him go. "You named 3 things about me," she said, before he reached it, without being told any of them. He paused, hand at the door. Didn't turn. "No one has ever done that," she said. Not asking anything. Just placing the fact between them because it felt like he should have it. He was quiet for a moment. "Sleep," he said finally. "The castle is cold, but the east wing fire holds well. You won't freeze." A beat. "I'd prefer that you didn't." He left. Ylva sat by the fire for a long time after, listening to the castle settle into night around her. She was thinking about the way he'd said that last sentence, the particular weight of preference in a man who, as far as she could tell, was not accustomed to preferring things he couldn't guarantee. She was also thinking, with a precision she would not let herself soften, that she had just been told she might be a weapon aimed at this kingdom, pointed by the king who had discarded her, and that the man she was apparently aimed at had told her so himself rather than waiting for her to discover it. She did not know what to do with any of that. She was going to have to. Chapter 3. The Court of Keldrath. The court gathered 3 days after her arrival, and Linus made her attend. He did not phrase it as a command. He sent a note, formal, brief, informing her that the evening's assembly would include her formal introduction and that appropriate dress had been arranged. The dress was already hanging in the sleeping room when she read the note. Dark green, beautifully cut, nothing like the plain gray she had arrived in. She stood and looked at it for a long time. In Vaildrun, fine clothing had always meant danger. It meant someone wanted something from you that required you to be visible. Invisibility had been her only reliable protection, and she had cultivated it with the same care other women cultivated alliances and marriage prospects. Now she was standing in an enemy kingdom being asked to put on a dress that announced her. She put on the dress. She was not in Vaildrun anymore. The hall looked different by evening, the braziers all lit, the carved walls catching the light at angles that made the ancient wolves seem to move. The court assembled in clusters that told her everything she needed to know about the politics of Keldrath before a single word was spoken. She read the room the way she always read rooms, who stood near whom, who watched the door, who watched Linus, who watched her. There were many who watched her. Linus was at the far end of the hall when she arrived, speaking with 2 men she would later learn were his generals. He looked up the moment she entered. She registered this without looking directly at him, the way you register a heat source without looking at the flame, and crossed the room to meet her with a directness that made the hall reconfigure slightly around his path. "Lady Nilsson," he said. "I'm not a lady," she said quietly. "I have no title." "You do now." He said it without ceremony, as though the matter were settled. "You are a protected guest of Keldrath. In this court, that means something." He offered his arm, the formal gesture, the public declaration of proximity, and she took it because refusing it in front of this many people would cost more than accepting it, and she had learned to calculate costs before she paid them. The hall noticed. She could feel the recalibration moving through the assembled court like a current, the particular shift of people who had made assumptions and were being informed, silently but clearly, that those assumptions were wrong. She had been brought here as tribute. A symbol. Nothing. And here was their king walking her into his court on his arm as though she were something he had chosen for reasons that had nothing to do with political convenience. The hostile ones made themselves known within the first hour. Lord Edric, dark-eyed, well-dressed, the kind of handsome that came from generations of being told you mattered, found his way to her side during a break in the formal presentations and smiled at her in the way of a man who believed that smiling made him hard to read. "The Veldrunian," he said. "We've been curious." "Have you?" she said. The king doesn't usually bother. The smile held. With tributes. She met his eyes and let the silence sit there just long enough to become uncomfortable. No, she said. How interesting. Tell me more about what the king usually bothers with. I'm trying to understand the shape of this court. He had expected her to flinch. She could see the recalibration happening behind his eyes, the slight rearrangement of a man who had assumed a target and found a person instead. He recovered well. She gave him that, pivoting to a different angle of conversation that she navigated through without giving him anything useful and without making him feel dismissed enough to become an active enemy. Linus reappeared at her side an hour into the evening, approaching from her left in a way that suggested he had been watching longer than she'd registered. Edric, he said, by way of greeting, not warmly. Edric excused himself. He's been testing me, Ylva said quietly, watching him go. He tests everything that enters this court. Linus took a glass from a passing attendant and offered it to her first, the automatic gesture of a man with manners he had never entirely discarded. He'll decide what you are and file you accordingly. It's how he operates. What will he decide I am? Linus looked at her sideways. Whatever makes you easiest to dismiss, he said. He finds it difficult when that doesn't work. She took a sip of the wine, which was darker and better than anything she'd had in Vaildrun. He'll find it difficult, then. Something at the edge of his expression again, that almost smile. Yes, he said. I expect he will. Later, near the end of the evening, there was music. The court arranged itself into the informal patterns of people who knew the steps and were performing the knowing of them. Linus did not particularly appear to be the kind of man who danced, but he looked at her with the expression of someone who understood that certain things in public spaces were simply required, and offered his hand. She had been taught the steps in Vaildrun in the years when someone had thought she might be useful at court functions before deciding she wasn't. She knew the forms. What she hadn't been prepared for was the cold. It intensified with proximity. Not unpleasantly, she would think about that word, unpleasantly, later and turn it over in her hands, but undeniably. Standing close enough to feel his hand at her waist, she could feel that second temperature pressing against her skin like a presence that was just barely restrained. You're aware of it, he said. Quietly, for her ears only. Not a question. The cold, she said. Yes. He looked at her. Something moved through his expression, not quite relief, not quite resignation. Something between them, something that had the quality of a door opening slightly. Most people don't notice it, he said. I notice things, she said. Yes, he said. I know. They finished the dance without speaking further. But his hand at her waist had a quality she felt for hours afterward, the cold of it, pressing through the fabric of her dress, specific and deliberate. As though it were trying to tell her something that Linus Larson had not yet found the words for. She thought about it walking back through the dark corridors to her chambers. She thought about it lying awake in the dark, with the castle settled around her and the fire burning low. She thought, whatever he is concealing, it is not small. She thought, I am going to need him to tell me. What she did not think, or what she refused to think, which was different, was that she had spent the entire evening in a court full of hostile strangers and had not once, not for a single moment, wished she were invisible. That particular realization she pushed down fast, folded it away, and told herself firmly that she would examine it at a later date. She was beginning to suspect that later date kept getting further away. Chapter 4. The cold inside him. He came to her at midnight, when the castle was fully quiet. She was awake. She had not been sleeping well, the cold making itself known in the hours between midnight and dawn as a restlessness she couldn't name, when she heard the knock. Not a servant's knock. Something more tentative, which surprised her, because tentative was not a quality she had associated with him. She opened the door. He looked worse than he had at the assembly. The careful control of his movements was more visible now, the specific way a man manages a body that is not entirely cooperating with him. His color was off, the firelight behind him illuminating something in his face that she had been reading as restraint and was now reconsidering entirely. I need to tell you something, he said. She stepped back from the door. He came in and sat by the fire, those careful movements, and she watched him settle and did not speak, because she had learned that silence was the best thing to offer a person who needed to find the beginning of a difficult sentence. "There is a curse," he said, "on my bloodline. It has been active for 8 years. She kept her face very still. My predecessor, the man I replaced, was not killed in battle, whatever the history say. He was killed by a practitioner of old magic. A woman who had grievances against Keldrath going back 3 generations. He looked at the fire. The method she used was designed to be slow, to take the throne first and then the man on it, in that order. He died within the year. By then the magic had transferred to the bloodline to me." "What does it do?" she asked. "Cold," he said, moving inward. "It started at the extremities 8 years ago. It's been progressing." He paused. "It has reached my chest." The fire crackled. Outside, the mountains were deep in their winter silence. "How long?" she asked. 6 months. Perhaps less. She absorbed this the way she absorbed all difficult information completely, without letting any of the processing show on her face. She was thinking very fast and very clearly, which was what she did when she was frightened, because she had learned that fear was most useful when it was pointed at something. "You kept me," she said slowly, "because you thought I could help." "I kept you," he said, "because you're the most observant person Alaric has ever sent me, and you are the only one who has not had any particular interest in my staying ignorant." He looked at her directly. "I need someone sharp enough to help me find what I've missed. Every scholar in Keldrath has been working on this for 3 years. I need a different mind. I have no training in magic. Neither do the scholars. We're working from texts, from history, from the records of what she did and what she used." A pause. "You are good at reading rooms. I need someone to read 8 years of dead ends and find the thing we didn't see." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "That is not flattery." "No," he agreed. "It is honesty. I find I prefer it to the alternative." She looked at him, at the careful stillness that she now understood was not control, but management, the daily work of a man whose body was slowly surrendering to something he hadn't chosen, and felt something move in her chest that she did not immediately identify. It was not pity. She had offered pity to enough people who didn't want it to know that this man would not either. It was something else. Something that felt uncomfortably like recognition. He was asking for her help. Not her compliance. Not her silence. Not the particular kind of usefulness that erased the person providing it. He was sitting in her firelit room at midnight and asking, plainly and without pretense, for her mind. No one had ever asked for her mind. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "I'll help you," she said. "But I need access to the archives. All of them, not the curated version your scholars have been working from. The primary sources. Done. And I need you to tell me everything. Not the version that makes it simpler. Everything." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with something in his voice she would think about later, "I find that is not a difficult thing to agree to. With you." She nodded once. Then, because it was midnight and he was clearly in pain and the performance of professional distance felt, in this particular moment, like a waste of both their time. "Does it hurt?" He blinked. The question had surprised him. She could see that. A fractional disruption of his composure. "Not the way you'd expect," he said finally. "It's more like pressure. From the inside. As though something is being slowly displaced. And tonight." A pause. "Tonight is a worse night than most." She got up, went to the table, poured water and brought it to him, a simple thing, the kind of thing you did for a person who was in pain and sitting in your room at midnight telling you true things. He accepted it without comment, but there was something in the way he took it, a momentary dropping of the careful distance he maintained, that told her it meant something. She sat back down. "Tell me about the practitioner," she said. "From the beginning. Everything you know," he told her. She listened with the full, organized attention that she had spent her life hiding from people who would have used it against her. She asked questions when she needed to. She noted the gaps, the places where the story became less certain, the threads that had been followed to their end, and the ones that hadn't. She was building a map in her head, the way she always built maps, carefully, from the edges inward. By the time he left, The fire had burned well down and the first gray of pre-dawn was pressing at the windows. He paused at the door. I looked back at her. You didn't ask why I trusted you with this, he said. No, she agreed. Why not? She met his eyes. Because you've decided I'm worth trusting, she said. And I find I'd rather not talk you out of it. That look again, the one she was running out of words to describe. The one that was not quite warm, but was oriented toward it, the way a compass needle orienting north was not the north itself, but pointed there without ambiguity. He left. Ylva sat alone in the cooling room with the gray dawn coming through the windows and a map in her head that had just become enormously more complicated and somehow, despite everything, despite the cold and the curse and the kingdom she could not leave and the king she could not read, somehow the most interesting thing anyone had ever given her to do. She got up, went to her desk, and started writing down everything she had just been told. There was, she noted to herself with the particular clarity of someone who had spent years having nothing to solve and was only now discovering what she was for, a great deal to work with. Chapter 5. The Hidden Clause. The spy arrived on a Tuesday, half-frozen and carrying intelligence that changed everything. Ylva had been in the archives for 19 days by then, the great vaulted rooms below the East Wing, where centuries of Keldrathi records were stored in a system that had been organized, at various points, by people with different philosophies about what organization meant. She had imposed her own order on the relevant sections. The scholars assigned to help her had, after the first week, stopped questioning her methods and started following them. Linus came to find her directly from the courier's debrief. She saw it in his face before he spoke. Something had shifted, something fundamental, and whatever it was had to do with her. She set down the document she'd been reading and turned to face him fully. Sit down, she said. He looked at her for a moment, the expression of a man who was accustomed to being the one who said sit down, and then sat, which told her more than it would have a month ago. Tell me, he told her. She listened without moving. The intelligence was detailed. A Keldrathi spy embedded in Vaildrun's apothecary district had intercepted a communication between the royal chemist and Alaric's private secretary. The peace treaty, the document she had carried across 4 days of mountain road, the paper she had stood in that hall and watched being signed, had been treated with a compound. A very specific compound, developed over years, designed to react with the particular signature of the curse already in Linus's blood. Prolonged exposure to the document would have accelerated the progression. Not killed him outright. Simply moved the timeline forward by years. Alaric had known about the curse. Alaric had known, and he had sent her here carrying a document designed to use her proximity to Linus as a delivery mechanism, and he had expected. The spy's intelligence was very clear on this point, that when Linus discovered the truth, he would kill her. The spy's report had included a direct transcription of Alaric's instruction. Let Larson deal with the asset when he finds it. Asset. She sat with that word for a moment. She had been many things to Alaric: ward, convenience, expendable body, but she had not, until now, known that she was also this. Linus was watching her. He had spread the documents on the table in front of her, and then sat back and watched her read them, and he was still watching, and she understood that he was doing what she had done that first night he had come to her room, offering her silence as a container for whatever she needed to put in it. He used me, she said. Not loud. Flat, the way certain truths were flat, not devastating in a theatrical way, but in a foundational one, the kind that required you to rebuild something from beneath. He has always used you, Linus said. The difference is that now you know. She looked at him. Why are you telling me this? Because it's yours to know. You could have dealt with it another way. Had me watched more closely. Removed the document and said nothing. Yes, he said. Why didn't you? He was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, because I find I have less and less tolerance for treating you as something to be managed. He met her eyes. You came here as a symbol. You are not a symbol. The least I can offer you is the truth of your own situation. She looked at the document on the table. The treaty. The thing she had carried across mountains in good faith, the good faith of a woman who had nothing left to lose, and had told herself that at least this task was simple and clear. sign, witness, return. A thing she could do correctly. She had not known. She had been the weapon without knowing the wound she was meant to make. The last thread of it, the small, stubborn part of her that had still thought of Veldran as home, still thought of Alaric as someone who might, in some reduced way, have considered her a ward rather than a tool, that thread was cut. She felt it go without grief, which surprised her slightly, but perhaps it shouldn't have. You couldn't mourn the loss of something that had never been real. What do we do now? She asked. We found the cure, he said. Together. She nodded once. Then she picked up the intelligence document, folded it precisely, and placed it with the other materials she had been cataloging. Her hands were steady. She had known, without being able to articulate it until now, that this was coming, some revelation that would make the shape of things clear. Now it was clear. Alaric had sent her here to die. Linus had told her when he could have used the knowledge against her. She had a choice to make, though it was already, in every practical sense, made. She was going to help Linus Larson survive. Not because she had no options. Not because she was afraid of him or indebted to him or had no other path. But because he was worth helping, and because the man who had sent her here to be used and discarded did not deserve to win, and because she was done. She was entirely and permanently done with being a thing other people aimed at targets without her consent. I've been looking at the practitioner's lineage, she said, pulling the relevant archive toward her. There's a branch the scholars haven't followed. A daughter who moved north 40 years ago. If the magic was anchored in bloodline, the anchor may still be. Ilva. She looked up. He was watching her with that expression. She still didn't fully have a word for the one that was oriented toward something, like a compass that had found its direction. Thank you, he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, Don't thank me yet. I haven't found it. She turned back to the archive. Let me find it first. She heard, rather than saw, the small sound he made. It was not quite a laugh. It was something quieter, and in some way she didn't yet understand, warmer. She filed it away with the rest of the things she was not yet ready to examine, and bent her attention back to the records of a dead woman's terrible magic, and began to trace the thread she had found toward whatever it was trying to show her. Chapter 6. What grows between them? Winter deepened, and something else deepened with it. She noticed it first in the evenings, the way the work had stopped being work in the strict sense, and had become instead a kind of conversation that used documents as its currency. He came to the archives every night now, not because she needed him there, but because he kept appearing anyway, settling into the chair across from her with the ease of a man who had decided a place was his without making a particular announcement of the fact. They talked about the curse. They talked about the practitioner's lineage, the northern branch she had found, the records of the daughter's life in a village above the snow line, the annotations in a margin that might be nothing or might be everything. They talked about Keldratha's history and his, and about the war that had preceded the peace that had sent her here. And then, because it was late and the fire was low and proximity had a tendency to expand the available subjects of conversation, they talked about other things. She told him about her mother. Not much. She had not talked about her mother in years, had learned early that the information was a vulnerability, that people used the losses of the powerless against them. But something about the quality of his attention, the way he listened without offering anything, without reaching for the information to arrange it into a shape that served him, made the telling feel safe. She told him about the village she had grown up in before Veldran. The smell of pine resin and river water. Her mother's hands, which had been, contrary to what the court women implied, a point of pride. He listened. He told her, in return, about his own predecessor, the man he had replaced not through ambition but through necessity, the terrifying specific weight of being the person left standing when everyone else capable of holding the line had fallen. About the years before the throne, when he had been simply a soldier with a talent for reading terrain and an inconvenient habit of telling commanders when their strategies were going to get men killed. Did they listen? She asked. Eventually, he said. It took several disasters. How many? Enough that I stopped expecting to be listened to and started simply putting myself in the position where the decision was mine. She looked at him across the table. That is a very precise description of how you ended up as king. Something at the corner of his mouth. Yes, he said. It is. She found herself, on those nights, doing something she had not done since she was very young and had not yet learned that it was dangerous. She forgot to manage her face. The work was too absorbing, and he was too direct, and somewhere in the third or fourth week of evenings in the archive, she had stopped maintaining the careful distance and started simply being in the room with him, which was a different thing entirely. She noticed the cold changing. Or not changing, retreating. On the evenings they worked, the particular atmospheric pressure of his presence seemed, on certain nights, to ease slightly. She was close enough, often enough, to compare. When he was elsewhere in the castle, the cold registered in the background of her awareness. When she was in the same room with him, particularly when they were deep in the work, it dimmed. She did not say anything about this. She kept it in the section of observations she was still processing. One night, late, she was struggling with a passage in a primary source. The handwriting badly deteriorated. The language an archaic form she had only partial training in, and had been frowning at it for long enough that her shoulders had risen without her noticing. He had been reading from his own stack across the table. He glanced over. What is it? This verb form. I have 3 possible translations, and none of them make the sentence do anything useful. He reached across without asking permission, the unconscious gesture of someone who had stopped thinking about whether permission was required, and turned the document toward him. She watched him read. He was quiet for a moment. It's a conditional, he said. Not a statement of fact, a contingency. Should the blood know its counterpart? She stared at the passage. Should the blood know its counterpart, she repeated slowly. Not find. No. As though recognition were the mechanism, he said, and looked up, and found her already looking at him, and they were close. The table was not large, and they had both been leaning toward the work, and she was near enough to see the specific quality of the cold now. Not as a temperature, but as something more like light, present and particular and directed entirely at her. She became aware of her own hands on the table. His were still on the document, not touching hers. Simply present in the same space, in the same way he was present in the same space, constant and deliberate and increasingly impossible to categorize as simply the man who had kept her here. Ilva, he said. Her name in his voice had a quality she had noticed before and had refused to analyze. She analyzed it now because she was a person who had always been better at facing things directly than pretending they weren't there. He said her name as though it mattered. Not as a title. Not as a description of her function. Simply her name, as though it were something worth saying carefully. She understood with the specific clarity of a woman who had spent her entire life refusing to want things, in serious trouble. I need to follow this thread, she said. Her voice was entirely steady, which she considered a personal achievement. If recognition is the mechanism, it changes what we've been looking for. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he sat back, the space between them restored. What does it change? She pulled the document toward her and began to talk through the implications, and he listened, and the fire burned lower, and outside the mountains held their winter silence, and she was aware, all the while, of the cold at the edges of her, gentler than she had ever felt it, almost warm, as though whatever lived in him had found something nearby that it recognized. She thought, this is becoming something I cannot pretend is only a strategy. She thought, I knew that 3 weeks ago. He reached across the table to steal her restless hands. She had been turning a pen over and over without realizing it, and placed his fingers over hers. Cold. Completely still. He did not say anything. She looked at their hands. You're the only person, he said quietly, who has ever argued with me as though she believed her own opinion mattered. It does, she said. I know, he said. I wonder, sometimes, whether you do. She looked up at him. The question sat in the air between them, and she did not answer it, because the honest answer required her to admit that she was only beginning to believe it, and that felt, for reasons she could not articulate yet, like the most important thing she had said or not said since she arrived in Keldrath. She turned her hand over beneath his, just slightly. An acknowledgement. Outside, the cold pressed against the castle walls. Inside, in the archive, something was just barely beginning to warm. Chapter 7. The Source of the Curse. The breakthrough came on a gray morning in the second month, when Ylva was so tired she had stopped feeling tired and arrived at the flat, clear state that lay on the other side of it. She had been in the archive since before dawn, following the northern thread through 4 generations of records that the scholars had judged irrelevant and filed accordingly. The practitioner's daughter had children. The children had had children. One of them, a woman dead 40 years, had kept records of her own. Not magical records. Household records. The kind of documentation nobody looked for in archives because it was considered beneath notice. Ylva had looked for it because she had spent her life being considered beneath notice and knew exactly where things ended up when people stopped paying attention to them. The root was mentioned in a household ledger for the year the woman died. Preserved in brine, stored in the royal apothecary of Veldrun, she had traded it there, decades ago, in exchange for winter medicines. The ledger even named the vault. She sat back in her chair and looked at what she had found for a long moment. Then she went to find Linus. He received the information with the stillness he brought to everything that mattered, sitting forward over the documents she spread before him, reading what she'd found, reading it again. She watched his face. She had become expert over these weeks at reading the specific geography of his expressions. This one, the shift from tension to something she would have called, in another man, hope she had not seen before. Veldrun, he said. The Royal Apothecary, Vault 7. The ledger is dated. The description is specific enough that it couldn't be anything else. She paused. No Keldrithite agent can retrieve it. The vault is warded. We'll find a way. I know a way, she said. He looked up from the documents. I grew up in those corridors, she said. I know the servant passages. I know which guards take long breaks and when the ward keepers change shifts. I know the face of every person Alaric trusts, which means I know the face of every person who would recognize me and the face of every person who wouldn't. She met his eyes. I can retrieve it. No. Linus. No. He stood. The careful movements of a man whose chest had been pressing painfully for 3 days, she knew, because she had learned to read the small signs he thought he was concealing. I am not sending you into the kingdom whose king sent you here as an instrument of my death. You're not sending me. I'm going. Is there a distinction? Yes, she said. The distinction is that you don't have the authority to stop me. He looked at her. She held his gaze. I made you a promise, she said, more quietly. The night you told me everything. I said I would help you survive. I intend to keep that promise, and the only way to keep it is to go to Veldrun and retrieve what you need. She paused. I am not your prisoner. I haven't been for some time. I think we both know that. If something happens to you, then at least I will have chosen it. She heard the weight in her own voice and didn't try to lighten it. For once in my life, I would like to choose. He was silent for a long time. Long enough that she thought, for one difficult moment, that he was going to refuse her anyway, that the choice she had claimed so clearly was going to be taken from her by exactly the kind of man who usually took things from her. But Linus Larsson was not that kind of man. She had known that, she realized, for some time. He walked to the window. I looked out at the mountains. His back to her, the cold pressing at the air around him, and she watched the line of his shoulders do the specific work of a person accepting something they had not wanted to accept. You'll need a cover, he said finally. She exhaled slowly. I know. I can pose as a returning ward of the court. Alaric has too many of us to keep track of. I was invisible when I was there. I'll be invisible again. You'll need funds. Clothing. A story for the gate guards. Yes. You'll need to know that if Alaric finds you. I know the risk. She waited. He turned from the window. His face was doing something she hadn't seen before, not the controlled stillness, not the almost expression, but something open and difficult and very human. I don't want you to go, he said. It was such a plain thing to say. No diplomatic softening, no management of its implications. Simply the truth, offered with the same directness. He had offered her everything since the night he had sat in her room at midnight and told her about the cold moving toward his heart. She crossed the room. She stood close enough to feel the cold of him, familiar now, a presence she had stopped flinching from. She looked up at him. "I know," she said. "I'm going anyway." Something moved through his face. Then, deliberately, he reached up and tucked a loose strand of hair back from her temple, the touch of a person who had made a decision, and said, very quietly, "Come back." "I will," she said. He prepared her a horse. She left before dawn, with funds and a cover story and the specific knowledge of a woman who had been invisible in Valedrun her entire life and intended to use that now, in the way she had learned to use everything that had been done to her, as a tool that cut in her favor for once. Behind her, as the city's dark outline receded into the mountain pass, she did not look back. She had spent enough of her life looking at things that were behind her. Ahead, through the gray pre-dawn, Valedrun waited. The kingdom that had never wanted her. She was going back for what it held, and she was going to take it, and she was going to return. She had promised. Chapter 8. The kingdom that never wanted her. Valedrun looked exactly the same. That was the first thing she registered as she rode through the outer gates on a gray afternoon, wearing a plain cloak and a face she had spent her whole life perfecting, the face of a woman who was nobody in particular, passing through a world that belonged to other people. Golden spires above the merchant quarter. Wood smoke and crowded streets. The smell of ambition and old money, which she had never been able to separate. The particular sound of a court city, voices negotiating in every doorway, horses on cobblestone, the distant bells of the administrative quarter marking the hour. It looked the same, and she did not. She understood this within the first hour, the strange sensation of moving through familiar geography as an entirely different person. She had been invisible in these streets for years, and she was invisible still, but it felt different now. Before, she had been invisible because she was nothing. Now she was invisible because she had chosen it, which was a distinction that turned out to matter enormously. She stabled the horse in the outer quarter, under a name that wasn't hers, and spent the afternoon moving through the city with the methodical patience of someone who had learned to treat observation as labor. She catalogued what had changed. Not much. Court cities were conservative. They changed at the pace of the men who controlled them, and Alaric was not a man who invited change. But the atmosphere was different in small ways she could read. The guards at the inner gates had a new nervousness about them. The merchants in the eastern quarter were quieter than usual. Something was wrong somewhere, the way things were always subtly wrong when a court was keeping secrets that were getting too large. She thought about Linus. The cold around him, pressing closer. The 6 months that might be less. She moved faster. The servant passages were exactly as she remembered them. She had spent years in these corridors, the back routes used by castle staff, the passages that connected kitchens to dining rooms, laundries to bedchambers, archive rooms to the administrative spaces where real decisions were made while the throne room staged its performances. She had learned every inch of them in the years when the only thing that kept her safe was knowing how to leave a room before she was seen. She navigated them now with a precision that was muscle memory rather than thought. The ward keepers changed shifts at the second bell of evening. She had 40 minutes in the vault corridor unobserved. She was there in 35. The vault was smaller than she'd expected from the ledger description, tucked into the lower level of the apothecary wing in a section that predated the current castle by a century. The warding was old, the kind that recognized unfamiliar magical signatures, which meant nothing to her, because she had no magic. She had only the fact of herself, which had always been the only thing she had, and she walked through the ward without resistance and stood in the vault and found it. The root. Preserved exactly as the ledger had described, dark, resinous, sealed in a brine jar so old the wax had gone brown at the edges. She wrapped it in the cloth she'd brought, placed it in the inner lining of her cloak, and turned to leave. She found the records by accident. Or not by accident, she found them because she looked, because she had always looked, because every room she had ever entered she had mapped before she left. A locked cabinet at the back of the vault, old enough to predate the current filing system, old enough that no one had thought to include it in the recent security assessment. The lock was mechanical rather than warded. She had been picking mechanical locks since she was 12 years old. Inside, filled with the specific orderliness of a man who understood that his crimes needed to be documented for leverage but could never be allowed to surface, were 40 years of Alaric's private records. She read for 20 minutes. Then she took everything she could carry and put it inside her cloak with the root, and she left the vault exactly as she had found it, and she walked back through the servant passages with the same careful, invisible stride she had arrived with, and she did not let herself think about what she'd read until she was clear of the castle walls entirely. She was 3 streets from the stables when Alaric's guards found her. They were looking for someone. She understood immediately, not specifically her, but for the category of person she was, the lone woman moving quickly in the direction of the outer gate at an hour when lone women moving quickly invited scrutiny. There were 3 of them. She assessed this in the 2 seconds before they registered her and made the calculation that running would cost more than standing still. She stood still. Court papers, the lead guard said. She produced them, the forged documents, the returning ward's identification, the story she had prepared. She watched his face read them. She kept her hands loose at her sides and her face arranged in the expression of a woman who found document checks a mild inconvenience rather than a threat to her continued existence. He looked up. She met his eyes. "What business?" he said. "Personal. I had family in the outer quarter." She let the past tense sit there, understood and not explained. He looked at her a moment longer. Then, "Move along." She moved. She did not run. She walked, at exactly the pace of a woman with nothing to hide, through 3 more streets and into the stables where she collected the horse and paid for the stabling and rode out through the outer gates into the gray evening. And it was only when the city walls had dropped behind the first rise of the road that she let herself breathe fully. She had been halfway down the main corridor when she had met Alaric. Not by chance. He had been moving toward the apothecary wing himself. She had heard his footsteps, that particular rhythm she had spent years learning to avoid, and had turned into a side passage 1 second before he rounded the corner. She had stood in the dark and listened to him pass 6 feet from where she stood, and she had not moved, and she had not breathed, and she had thought, with a clarity that surprised her by its absence of fear, "I am done being afraid of this man." When he had passed, she had stepped back into the corridor. She had not confronted him. She had not needed to. What was in her cloak was enough, more than enough. What she was carrying back to Keldrath would dismantle everything he had built, not through violence or theater, but through the specific, patient, devastating mechanism that powerful men most feared, evidence, properly placed, in the hands of people who had every reason to act on it. She rode through the night. The mountains rose ahead of her, dark against a sky beginning to show stars. Keldrath lay somewhere beyond them, and in it a man who was running out of time and had looked at her from the moment she crossed his threshold, as though she were a language he had always been trying to read. She thought about his hand over hers in the archive. She thought about the cold that eased when she was near. She thought about the word he had said to her last before she left. "Come back." She bent forward over the horse's neck and rode faster. Chapter 9. The Choice. She arrived at the Veldrunian noble quarter at dawn to find that the contact she had positioned 3 weeks ago had done exactly what she had asked. Lord Castle, the same Lord Castle who had stood in Keldrath's great hall and failed, twice, to argue Ylva back out of it, had turned out to be exactly what she had suspected when she first assessed him, a man of self-interest rather than principle, which meant a man who could be redirected. She had sent him a letter from Keldrath's court, sealed with enough circumstantial proof to make the accusation credible, and Castle, calculating his options, as he always calculated his options, had moved the evidence she'd sent to exactly the right hands. The noble council was already in emergency session when she arrived. She did not go to them. She went to the one person in Veldrun who had ever, once, treated her with something that might charitably be described as fairness, Lady Astrid, 80 years old, sharp as winter, and possessed of a profound personal dislike for Alaric that she had never bothered to conceal because she was 80 years old and had stopped caring about the consequences of honesty some decades past. Ylva laid out everything on Lady Astrid's table. The records from the vault. The intelligence from Keldrath. The hidden clause in the peace treaty, documented and explained. The list of names, nobles who had signed the warrant for her mother's death. A 20-year-old crime Alaric had used as leverage against a woman who had discovered something inconvenient about his first year on the throne. Lady Astrid read in silence. She read for a long time. Then she said, without looking up, "You were the girl in gray." "I was," Ylva said. "I thought," Lady Astrid said slowly, "when he pointed at you in that throne room, that he was sending you to die. He was." A pause. And instead, Ylva said, "I'm here. With this. And I needed to reach the right people before I leave." "Leave?" Lady Astrid looked up. "You're going back?" "Yes." The old woman looked at her for a long time. Then she said, "The girl who came to this court had the face of someone who expected nothing." "She did," Ylva agreed. "You don't have that face anymore." Ylva held her gaze. "No," she said. "I don't." Lady Astrid nodded once, the decisive nod of a woman who had made a decision and had no interest in revisiting it. "Leave it with me," she said. "I'll see it placed. Every name, every document. By the time Alaric understands what's happening, there will be nothing left to contain." She paused. "He'll come for you. He can try." She meant it. That surprised her, slightly, the cleanness of it, the absence of the fear she had carried for years whenever Alaric's name came up in any context. She had walked through the castle where she had spent 17 years being made small, and she had not been small, and now she was sitting in a court drawing room with documents that would end the man who had tried to use her as an instrument of murder, and she felt, underneath the exhaustion and the urgency, clear. The session with Castle lasted 20 minutes. He was, as always, efficient when he understood where the incentives lay. She told him what she needed, what she was leaving with Lady Astrid, and what she expected in return. He agreed with the speed of a man who had already decided the current arrangement was no longer advantageous. She was on the road before midday. The return journey was harder than the first. She was tired in a way that had gone past her body and into something deeper, the tiredness of someone who had been running on purpose and will for long enough that the mechanics of rest had stopped being available. She pushed through it. The mountains ahead were very large and very cold, and she was going to ride through every inch of them. She thought about the route in her cloak. She thought about the vault and the records and Lady Astrid's face as she read them. She thought about the 20 years of Alaric's crimes, documented in his own careful hand, and about the specific quality of a man who keeps records of his wrongdoing. The arrogance of a person who believes he will never be in a position where those records can be used against him. He had been in that position for some time. He simply hadn't known it. He had known it when he sent her to Keldrath. That was the thing she hadn't understood, the thing she turned over in her mind on the mountain road as the cold came down from the peaks and the last of the afternoon light left the sky. Alaric had chosen her specifically. Not because she was expendable. Because she had found the records before, 20 years ago, and had been too young and too powerless to do anything about them. He had spent 2 decades making sure she stayed that way. And then he had sent her to Keldrath. The worst miscalculation of his life had been assuming she would stay nothing. She thought about Linus. About the cold that would be worse now. She had been gone 12 days. 12 days of the curse without whatever her proximity did to it. 12 days of progression she could not account for. She thought about the way he had looked at her in the archive, in the firelight, with his hand over hers and her name in his mouth, like something he was being careful with. She thought, "I'm going home." And then, for the second time, she realized she had thought that. And this time she didn't push it away. She rode through the night. Chapter 10. The warmth returned. She arrived to find him dying. Not metaphorically. Not in the slow, managed way he had been dying for 8 years. The curse had accelerated in her absence, 12 days, and it had moved with a speed that the scholars said they had never seen, as though the thing inside him had understood it was running out of time and had stopped being patient about it. He was in his chambers. The castle had a quality she had never felt in it before, a stillness that was not the usual controlled quiet, but something frightened and held. The specific hush of a building full of people who did not know how to help and were afraid of what happened if they couldn't. The cold hit her before she reached the corridor. Not the familiar pressure, not the atmospheric hum she had grown accustomed to over weeks of proximity. This was immense and cold and sharp as a blade, a temperature that had stopped being contained. She walked through it without slowing. She had the root in her hands before she reached the door. The scholars were inside. 3 of them, exhausted past expression, surrounded by open texts and the particular disarray of people who had been working without sleep and running out of options. They looked at her when she entered with the faces of people who had stopped believing help was coming and were now revising that assessment. "The root," she said. She placed it on the central table. "Everything you need to know about the preparation is here." She pulled the secondary documents from her cloak, the notes from the vault, the practitioner's daughter's household records with their marginalia about the specific chemistry of the cure. The conditional in the primary source wasn't metaphorical. It's procedural. The blood must recognize its counterpart. That's not a description of a feeling. It's a description of a mechanism. You'll need to work fast. She went to the inner room. Linus was on the bed and did not look like himself. The cold had covered him. She could see it, which she hadn't expected to be able to. Frost patterns across his skin, fractal and precise, spreading from his chest outward across his collarbone and throat. Beautiful and terrible and wrong. His eyes were closed. His breathing was present but barely. She sat beside him. She took his hand, which was cold enough to burn, and held it in both of hers and felt the cold rush up her arms like something answering a question it had been waiting to ask. "I'm here," she said. Not for him to hear, necessarily. For herself. The scholars worked through the night. She stayed. She had studied enough by now, the weeks in the archive, the documents from the vault, the particular grammar of old magic that turned out, like all grammars, to become legible once you had spent enough time with it, to understand what the final stage of the ritual required. The root was prepared correctly. The invocation from the primary source. And the final mechanism, blood freely given and warmth freely shared, by someone the cold had recognized. Should the blood know its counterpart? She understood now what it meant. The cold had been reaching for her since she arrived. Every evening it eased in her presence. Every night in the archive it had retreated slightly. Not because of anything she had done or been trained to do. Because she was, in the specific technical language of a 40-year-old curse, exactly what it had been looking for without knowing it, the counterpart. The particular warmth that this particular cold was designed to dissolve against. She had not been sent here by accident. Not by Alaric's plan, that had been poison, a weapon pointed at a man already dying. But by something older and less concerned with politics, which had arranged, with the patience of forces that operated on a longer timeline than courts or kings. For the person the curse could not survive to end up in the same room as the person the curse was killing. She pressed her palm to his chest, over the fractal patterns. Her blood from a small cut on her wrist, applied where the scholars told her. The invocation said aloud, which felt strange and did not feel strange at all, which was its own kind of answer. The cold pulled at her hand like a current. She held on. She felt it happen, not dramatically, not like the stories she'd heard about magic always made it sound. It simply stopped. The cold reached for her and found her and recognized what it had found, and in the recognition, lost the thing it needed to persist. Like a fire recognizing the water that will end it. Like a held breath finally released. The frost patterns faded from his skin. The temperature in the room returned to the ordinary cold of a winter night in the mountains. His breathing changed, deepened, steadied, the breathing of a person who had come back from the edge of somewhere they hadn't meant to go. His eyes opened. She was still above him, exhausted and tear-streaked, and she hadn't known she was crying until the tears were there, because she had not cried since she was 11 years old and had decided that it cost too much and changed too little. Now it appeared the cost and the calculus had both changed, and she was sitting beside Linus Larson, who was alive, and her face was wet, and she was not going to do anything about it. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached up and touched her face, the gesture of a man checking that something was real, and she turned her cheek slightly into his hand the way she had not, in her memory, ever permitted herself to do with anyone. "I told you I would come back," she said. Her voice was steady, which was another personal achievement. "I told you not to go," he said. "You did," she agreed. "And I went anyway. I think that should tell you something about how this is going to work." He laughed. It was the warmest sound she had ever heard. Not because it was loud or remarkable, but because it came from a man who had been carrying a cold in his chest for 8 years, and it was entirely, completely warm. Spring came to Keldrath slowly, and then all at once, the way springs came to mountain kingdoms, grudging through the first weeks, then suddenly, the valley below the castle going green in the course of a week as though the land had been waiting for permission. Alaric was gone by then. The noble council of Vaildrun had moved with the decisive speed of people who had always known and had simply required the specific arrangement of evidence that could no longer be ignored or suppressed. Lady Astrid had placed everything correctly, as she had promised. The names on the warrants, the records from the vault, the hidden clause in the peace treaty, it had all come apart the way lies came apart when they were finally exposed to air, completely and faster than anyone had managed it while it was still being kept. The peace between Vaildrun and Keldrath was being rebuilt now, not from a document written in poison, not from a gesture requiring a living symbol, but from actual negotiation, actual agreement. Actual acknowledgement that two kingdoms sharing a mountain range had more to gain from cooperation than from the particular expensive game of sending weapons at each other disguised as tribute. Ylva stood on the balcony of the East Tower on a morning in late spring and looked at the valley below, which was her valley now. In the same practical sense that the room had been her room and the archive had been her archive, and the man who had appeared unannounced at her door at midnight with a terrible problem had become hers too carefully over time, in the way that things became yours when you chose them. Linus found her there, as he usually found her, without announcement, with the ease of a man who had stopped thinking of any space she occupied as separate from him. He stood behind her, and she leaned back into him, and his arms came around her shoulders with the warmth of a person whose cold had entirely, finally departed. "Alaric sent you to seal a peace," he said. "He did," she agreed. "I don't think this is what he had in mind." She looked at the valley below. The green of it. The mountains shedding their winter, the kingdom that had never been supposed to be hers spreading out alive and real and full of people who called her by name. "No," she said. "I think he had in mind that I would disappear. Quietly. Without anyone noticing." And instead, she turned her face up toward his. Behind them the castle was awake and moving, and below them the valley was green, and somewhere in the administrative wing a delegation from Vaildrun was waiting to negotiate a peace treaty that was real this time. And instead, Ylva said, I stayed. He pressed his lips to her temple, warm and deliberate, and she closed her eyes and held the moment and did not, for the first time in as long as she could remember, feel any need to brace for what came after. Nothing was coming after. This was the after. She had thought, once, that surviving was its own destination. She knew better now. Surviving was only the road. This, the warm arms, the green valley, the castle that had made room for her not because she was useful or expendable or a symbol of something larger, but because she had chosen it and it had chosen her back. This was the arrival. She had been sent here as tribute. She had become something no one had planned for, including herself. She stayed.
If you enjoy watching this story, please like and subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.